I noticed it the moment he asked about the deed. Not the first time he asked, and not the second. It was the third time, sitting right there at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee I'd made him, smiling at me with that easy smile of his, and I remember thinking, why does a man keep coming back to the same question? I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually started. My name is Roberta, and I've lived in the same house in Clarksville, Tennessee for 31 years. My husband passed 9 years ago, pancreatic cancer, fast and brutal, gone in 4 months from diagnosis to burial. After the funeral, after everyone drove home and the casserole dishes stopped appearing on my porch, I was left with a 3-bedroom house, a 2007 Ford F-150 that needed new brake pads, and a decision to make about what the rest of my life was going to look like. I chose to keep working. I'd been a registered nurse for 26 years, and the hospital kept me on part-time for another 4 after Walter died. When I finally retired, I had my pension, a small investment account my husband had been quietly building since 1994, and the house, paid off, sitting on an 1.5 acres at the end of a gravel road that still floods a little every March. We were never wealthy in the way people imagine wealthy. We shopped sales. We drove used cars. My daughter grew up knowing that money was something you protected, not something you talked about at the dinner table with strangers. Walter believed that fiercely, and I agreed. What we had because we were careful. Nobody handed us anything. My daughter. I'll call her my daughter because that's what she is to me, the whole of her. She grew up kind and a little headstrong, and with her father's habit of going quiet when she was upset instead of saying what was wrong. She moved to Nashville after nursing school, working in a pediatric unit downtown, sharing an apartment with 2 other nurses, calling me on Sunday mornings while I had my coffee. She met him at a friend's birthday party. She told me about him on a Sunday in March 3 years ago, and I could hear in her voice that particular excitement a woman has when something has just started and is still full of possibility. She said he was funny. She said he made her feel calm. I asked his name, Lyle, and I asked what he did for work, and she said he was in sales, medical equipment, and that he travelled a lot but was trying to transfer to a position closer to home. I told myself that meant ambitious. Later I understood it meant something else. I met Lyle for the first time that following June at a barbecue my daughter hosted at her apartment complex. He was 38 then, lean and tan, with a kind of handshake that's slightly too firm, the kind that's been practiced. He laughed easily. He complimented my potato salad twice. He asked me where I was from, how long I'd lived in Clarksville, whether I'd grown up in Tennessee. All normal questions. All the questions anyone asks when they're meeting someone new and trying to seem interested. But then maybe 40 minutes in, standing by the grill while my daughter was inside getting more drinks, he asked about my house. I said it was a nice property, 3 bedrooms, good-size yard. He nodded. He asked how long I'd owned it. I told him 31 years. He asked if it was just me there now. I said yes, just me. He said that was a lot of house for one person. I said I managed fine. He smiled and changed the subject, and I filed it away as small talk, the way you do. The second visit was Thanksgiving. My daughter drove down, and she brought Lyle, and we sat around the table I'd had since 1989 and ate the meal I've made every year since Walter died. Roast turkey, sweet potato casserole with the little marshmallows on top, the way my daughter has always liked, green beans from the garden I'd put up in jars in August. Lyle helped clear the dishes and said it was the best meal he'd had in years. My daughter looked at him when he said it, and I could see she believed him completely. After dinner, while my daughter was watching a movie in the living room, Lyle and I sat at the kitchen table with decaf and pecan pie. He asked about the neighborhood. He asked if property values had gone up. He asked whether I'd ever thought about downsizing. I told him I hadn't. He said a house on this much land, this close to the city, must be worth something now. I said I supposed so. He said Walter had been smart to buy when he did. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and I noticed he was watching me with a careful kind of attention, not the casual interest of conversation, but something more deliberate, like he was measuring. I said yes, Walter was smart about a lot of things, and I changed the subject. The third time was Easter. He came again, and this time he asked about the deed directly, just like that, over coffee, while my daughter was in the shower. He said something about how he'd been reading about estate planning, about how complicated things could get when a property owner passed without the right documents in place, and had I thought about putting the house into a trust, or maybe adding someone to the deed, just to make things easier down the road. I set down my coffee cup. I said I had an attorney and that my documents were in order and that I wasn't worried. He said he just wanted to make sure I was taken care of. I said I had been taking care of myself for a long time. He smiled and said of course, and my daughter came downstairs and the conversation ended. But that night, after they drove back to Nashville, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. Something was sitting in my chest that I didn't have a word for yet. Not fear exactly, not anger, more like a slow, cold awareness, the way you feel when you're driving in the dark and you start to see the shape of something in the road and your foot moves to the brake before your brain has finished deciding what it is. I called my attorney the next morning. His name is Clifford. He's 64 years old. He went to high school with Walter, and he has handled everything for our family since 1987. I told him what Lyle had said. All 3 times. Clifford was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Roberta, don't sign anything. Don't let anyone add their name to anything, and call me if it happens again." I said I would. What I didn't tell Clifford, what I didn't tell anyone yet, was that a week before Easter my daughter had mentioned, casually, like it was nothing, that Lyle had stopped by my pharmacy to drop off a birthday card on her behalf when she was working a double shift. The pharmacy I'd been going to for 11 years, where they knew me, where my prescriptions were on file. I'd called the pharmacy that same day, asked if someone named Lyle had come in. The woman I spoke to, Greta, who has worked there longer than I have been a customer, went quiet for just a second too long. She said yes. He'd come in, said he was my daughter's fiancé, asked if my current medications were all up to date, said he was worried about me managing everything alone. Greta said she hadn't given him anything, but she sounded unsettled saying it. I thanked her, and I sat with that information the way you sit, with something heavy. Then I started being careful. I started keeping a small notebook in the drawer by the kitchen sink. Dates, what was said, who was present. I moved my will, the deed to the house, my investment account statements, my insurance policies, all of it, to a fireproof lockbox that I gave to Clifford to keep at his office. I put nothing important anywhere in the house that could be found and photographed. My daughter got engaged in September. She called me on a Sunday morning, her voice high and bright and full, and I cried with her because I loved her and because I was happy she was happy, and because even then, even knowing what I was beginning to know, I wanted to believe I was wrong about him. I spent the next 2 months trying to be wrong. I watched him at family dinners. I watched the way he spoke to my daughter, easy and warm in front of people, but occasionally, when he thought no one was paying attention, there was something slightly too careful about how he listened to her. The way you listen to someone when you're not quite on their side. I hired a private investigator. I want to say that plainly, without drama, because it was a practical decision and not a dramatic one. Her name was Bev, a woman about my age, retired from the county sheriff's department, who came highly recommended by Clifford. I paid her $1,400, and I told her what I knew, and I asked her to find out what I didn't. What Bev found took about 6 weeks. Lyle had been previously married, a fact my daughter did not know. He'd been married for 2 years in his early 30s to a woman in Memphis. She'd had a small inheritance from her grandmother. They'd divorced, and he'd walked away with half of a jointly held savings account that she'd added him to 14 months into the marriage. Nothing illegal about it. But the pattern was there. There was more. His employer, the medical equipment company, had terminated him 8 months ago. He was not transferring to a position closer to home. He was unemployed, living off savings, and the savings were running low. Bev found a text conversation, obtained legally through someone who knew someone. I won't ask further questions about how, in which Lyle told a friend that he was in the middle of something and would be fine by spring. Spring. The word landed in me like a stone into water. I called Clifford. I called Bev back. The 3 of us sat in Clifford's office on a Tuesday afternoon in November, and we made a plan. The wedding was set for March 15th, at a small venue outside Nashville, about 70 guests. My daughter had planned it herself, chosen everything herself, called me every Sunday with updates. Every Sunday I listened, and I helped, and I did not tell her. That was the hardest part, not the investigation, not the waiting, the Sundays. There were moments, many of them, when I nearly said something. When she called me excited about centerpieces, and I sat on my end of the phone thinking, I know something about the man you're planning your life around that you don't know, and I chose every time not to tell her, because I didn't yet have everything, and because if I told her without the full picture, he would know I knew, and I'd lose the chance to end it completely. I want to be clear about something. My daughter is not naive. She is a smart, capable woman who works in one of the hardest units in any hospital and has done it with grace for 12 years. Lyle had been careful with her. He had shown her only what he wanted her to see. The man who asked about the deed over Easter coffee was not the man she knew. That is not her failing. That is his deliberateness, and it took me outside the relationship to see it. I brought everything to my daughter in February, not on a Sunday phone call, in person. I drove to Nashville on a Wednesday, told her I wanted to take her to lunch. We sat in a booth at a diner she loves near the hospital, the kind of place with laminated menus and good pie, and I put the folder on the table, and I told her I needed her to hear me before she reacted. She heard me. She went very still, the way she has always gone still when something is wrong, her father's habit passed down whole, and she read through everything Bev had given me, the previous marriage record, the termination paperwork, the text. I watched her face move through disbelief, and then recognition, and then something I can only describe as grief. The specific grief of understanding that something you thought was real was built on a lie. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I want him to not get away with it. I said, then let me tell you what Clifford thinks we should do. Here is what we did. We did not cancel the wedding. We did not confront him. We let the planning continue, and while it continued, we worked quietly. Clifford had already ensured that my name alone was on every document of mine that mattered. My daughter, with Clifford's help, quietly opened a separate account and began moving her direct deposit there, an account Lyle did not know about. She had never added him to anything she had intended to after the wedding, which had been his suggestion. But now she didn't. 2 weeks before the wedding, Lyle asked my daughter to add him to her renter's insurance, just to start combining things. She said yes. She'd take care of it, and she never did. 1 week before the wedding, he asked again about my house. This time he asked my daughter, not me. He said that at her mother's age it would be good to have a plan, that maybe after the wedding they could talk to me together as a family. My daughter told me about it that same night. Her voice was flat and steady. She said, "I heard it this time." The wedding day was overcast, cool for March, the kind of day where the light is white and even, and everything looks a little like a photograph. I got dressed at the venue. My daughter had asked me to come early, help with her hair the way I've always done it for every formal occasion since she was 16. We were alone in the dressing room together, and we didn't say much. We didn't need to. Before she put on her veil, she looked at me in the mirror and said, "Stay close." I said, "I'm not going anywhere." Clifford was in the 3rd row. Bev was in the back near the doors. A detective from the Financial Crimes Unit, a contact Clifford had arranged, was standing outside in the parking lot in plain clothes. Everything that had been gathered over 5 months was in a sealed envelope in Clifford's inside jacket pocket. Lyle stood at the altar and he looked relaxed. That was the thing that stayed with me, how relaxed he looked. Like a man who had already decided how the day would end. My daughter walked down the aisle on her own, because that is what she'd always said she wanted to do. I watched her walk, and I watched Lyle watch her, and I saw the particular calculation behind his eyes that I had first seen at an Easter table over coffee, and I knew I had been right, and I was not glad to be right, but I was glad we were ready. The officiant began. When he reached the point where he asked if anyone had cause to object, Clifford stood up. Lyle's eyes found him immediately, then they found me. What happened in the next 20 minutes is a matter of record now. Clifford addressed the room calmly and professionally. He laid out, briefly and factually, what the investigation had found: the prior marriage, the job loss, the documented pattern of financial targeting. He presented the text message. He addressed Lyle directly and informed him that a detective was present and that the matter of attempted financial fraud was already under review. Lyle tried to speak twice. The second time the detective came inside. The guests were very quiet. The only sound I remember clearly was my daughter's breathing next to me, slow and deliberate, the breathing of a woman who has decided exactly who she is in this moment. Lyle left with the detective, not in handcuffs, that would come later, and it did when the full case was built and the charges were filed, but he left. He walked out of that room, and he did not come back. My daughter stood in her wedding dress in the middle of the venue, and she looked at the people who had come to celebrate her, and after a moment she said, "I'm sorry you saw that." And then she said, "I'm not sorry it happened here." There was a long silence. And then her co-worker, a woman named Faye, who has been her friend since their first year on the unit together, started clapping. And then others did too. We stayed, we ate the food, we drank the champagne that had been meant for toasting a marriage, and instead we toasted my daughter's freedom and her clarity, and the fact that she had trusted her mother enough to let me help her when she needed help. She moved back home for a few months while she found her footing. We spent the evenings on the back porch, me with my decaf, her with whatever tea she was drinking that month, and we talked about her father, and the house, and what she wanted her life to look like now. She cried sometimes. I let her cry without trying to fix it. By summer she had an apartment she loved, a promotion she'd been working toward for 2 years, and a therapist she saw every other Thursday who she said was very good. She called me on Sunday mornings, same as always. Lyle's case moved slowly, the way these things do. Eventually there was a plea agreement. He did not go to prison for long, but he went, and there is a record now that will follow him. Enough. Last October, Clifford retired and handed my file to his associate, a younger woman who knows everything and whom I already trust. My documents are in order. The house is still mine. The acre and a half still floods a little every March. My daughter came down for Thanksgiving last month. She made the green bean casserole herself this year, standing in my kitchen, asking me about the proportions of the cream of mushroom soup, the way she has asked me every year since she started cooking. I stood beside her and told her, same as I always have. After dinner we sat at the table and she reached across and held my hand for a moment without saying anything. That was enough. That was everything. I have been a nurse for most of my adult life, and one thing that work teaches you, if it teaches you anything, is the difference between the calm of someone who is well and the calm of someone who is only pretending to be. I saw through Lyle because I have spent decades learning to see through surfaces, because I paid attention, because my daughter trusted me enough to let me see what she could not see from inside it. If there is anything I would want someone to take from this, it is that. Pay attention. Ask the question again when something doesn't sit right. Don't dismiss the feeling in your chest that moves your foot to the brake before your brain has finished deciding. I caught it in the way he paused. The first pause that June afternoon, when I told him I managed fine on my own. Just a half-second too long before he smiled and changed the subject. A half-second was enough. I think about that half-second a lot. The pause before the smile, the breath Lyle took before he changed the subject that first June afternoon when I told him I managed fine on my own. Most people would have missed it. I almost did. What I've come to understand is that the outcomes of our lives are not random. They follow from the choices we make quietly, over years, before any crisis arrives. Walter and I chose to keep our documents in order. We chose an attorney we trusted. We chose not to talk about money carelessly. None of that felt significant at the time. It felt like paperwork, like adult tedium. But when it mattered, every single one of those choices was a wall that held. Lyle counted on me being careless. He counted on the assumption that a 60-something widow, living alone, managing a house on her own, would be grateful for attention and too tired to be suspicious. That is what people like him rely on. Not stupidity, but the ordinary human tendency to trust what presents itself as kindness. I don't blame myself for not seeing it immediately. I blame myself for nothing, actually. What I did once I saw it was act on what I knew was right rather than on what was comfortable. That distinction matters. It would have been easier to say nothing to my daughter before the wedding, easier to hope I was wrong, to avoid the conversation, to let it play out. The easier path in that situation was also the cowardly one. My daughter needed the truth more than she needed me to protect her from it, and knowing that, and doing it anyway, was the hardest thing I've done since I sat in a hospital room and watched my husband leave. Doing the hard right thing instead of the easy wrong one. I was a nurse long enough to know that quality doesn't announce itself. You find out whether you have it when the moment arrives and there is no comfortable option left. My daughter had it too. She sat in that diner booth and she read everything, and she did not fall apart. She went still, and then she said she wanted him to not get away with it. That steadiness. The willingness to face something painful and then decide what to do next rather than just react. That came from somewhere inside her that no one gave her. She built it herself over 12 years of difficult shifts and hard days and choosing to keep going. I was proud of her before that afternoon. I have not had the right word for what I felt after it. Anne Clifford, Bev Fay, who started clapping in a quiet room and gave everyone else permission to follow. The people who showed up were the people who had always been there, doing small things consistently over years. That is how trust works. It is not declared. It is accumulated. What Lyle got wrong, in the end, was that he looked at my life and saw a woman alone. He did not see the 30 years of careful choices behind her, or the people those choices had drawn close, or the kind of daughter that kind of life produces. He saw what was on the surface. That was always going to be his undoing. A half second, that's all it took to start paying attention. Pay attention, not with fear, but with clarity. The people who mean you well do not need to know what you own. The ones who keep asking are telling you something whether they mean to or not. Listen,